Wednesday, everybody. Hope your Wednesday, your hump day is off to a good start. Mine is too so far. Um, Last week, I took a few minutes and reflected on the love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, and I decided that today and probably the next couple of Wednesdays, I'll look at the lectionary epistles as well, and these will come from 1 Corinthians 15. So for this morning, we've all heard the song about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And it begins something like this. We know of Dasher and Dancer and Prancer and Vixen, but have you heard of the most famous reindeer of all? That, of course, being Rudolph. Now, what in the world does that have to do with the Bible? We all know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're the four Gospels. But at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15, Paul gives us his version of the Gospel as well. In just a matter of few verses, Paul summarizes the Gospel. Not Gospel in terms of a book, like Mark or Luke or John or something, but Gospel in terms of the good news. And in fact, the very word gospel means good news. Here's how Paul summarizes the gospel. Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he is buried, that he is raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am. And his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believe. And so we have there, condensed into a few verses, the gospel according to Paul. The gospel that I preached, Paul says, the gospel that I preached, the gospel that you received. Good news, to be good news, has to be preached. It has to be conveyed. And for it to be good news, it has to be heard and responded to. Which you received and in which you stand, by which you are being saved. So here's the gospel, good news that I preached, that you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved. As an aside, our salvation can be looked at multiple ways. We can look at it as I was saved at a given time, and that given time could be whatever the time was that you first believed. You could say that I was saved at the cross. They're both accurate. You can just as easily say that I will be saved at the end. And we can say, as Paul says here, that we are being saved. I have been saved, I am being saved, and I will be saved. They're all accurate. So what is this gospel? What is this good news? That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. Christ died for our sins. Christ died for our sins. And for our sins, meaning that his death does something. He didn't simply suffer and die because, well, we're bad people. But there was a purpose to it. There was a purpose to Christ's death, and that purpose was to make us right with God. That purpose was to reconcile us to God. It is an atoning death, and maybe sometime I'll go into a description of some of the different theories of atonement. Might be a good thing to do during Lent, actually. But his death was for our sins. It accomplished something. It brought us reconciliation with God. He is buried. He is buried, put in a tomb. He's dead. Then he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. But notice that both his death and the resurrection are in accordance with the scriptures. Paul says there's Old Testament precedence for that. There's Old Testament prophecies behind that. I remember, I think about Romans 4:25. But he was delivered up for our trespasses and raised for our justification. He was delivered for our trespasses and raised for our justification. Is his resurrection, Jesus' resurrection, is the guarantee of our own bodily resurrection. Jesus' resurrection is a guarantee of the ultimate defeat of death. Here's the gospel, Paul says. You want the gospel in a nutshell? Paul says, here you go. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. He was buried, rose on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. There it is. And then Paul goes into the post-resurrection appearances. And we might look at these as being evidences for the resurrection. If you doubt what I'm saying, here's your proof. He appeared to Cephas. Another way of saying Peter. He appeared to Peter. Then he appeared to the disciples. And then he appeared to 500 at one time. That's a curious thing because we don't have a recorded episode like that in the Gospels. So Paul clearly knew of an occasion where Christ appeared to 500 plus people that isn't recorded in one of our canonical Gospels. And Paul says, and if you doubt what I'm saying, most of those people that saw him then are still alive now. Then he appeared to James and to the apostles. And lastly of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. And Paul says, I'm the least of the apostles. I'm the least of the apostles. Why is he least of the apostles? He wrote a good chunk of the New Testament. He says he's the least of the apostles because he came later than the others, or most of the others, and because he had been a persecutor of the church. He's the least of the apostles because he'd been a persecutor of the church. He was later than most of them. But now he's an apostle. And how does that work? How does one who had been a persecutor of the church go on to become an apostle of Jesus Christ? It says, by the grace of God I am what I am. And that's an apostle. By the grace of God I am what I am. And that's an apostle, Paul says. Paul had been a persecutor of the church. He was on his way to Damascus to try to imprison Christians. Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus. Jesus saved him. Christ saved Paul. And you could, like I said, you could say that he saved him at the cross. You could say that he saved him when Paul first believed. And then Christ made him an apostle. And that's the gospel. The gospel. That Jesus died in accordance with the scriptures. That he was raised, that he was buried, that he was raised the third day in accordance with the scriptures. He died for our sins, he was buried, he was raised. He died for our sins, he was buried, he was raised, and this is for us. This is for us. It was for Paul, it is for us, and the Christ that called Paul to be an apostle, even Paul, who had been a persecutor of the church, that Christ sometimes still calls us as well. Here is the gospel. Jesus died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. He is buried, and he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. That is the good news. That is the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it is the gospel by which we are being saved. Have a great Wednesday.